Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this platform, Sally Goodwin Ministries platform, that encompasses Igero Prophetic School, Activate Her, and Church Without Walls. I was about to repeat Sally Goodwin Ministries again, sorry about that, and Church Without Walls, which is just this incredible growing community and just absolutely loving what God is doing in the space at the moment and in the church, the church as in the Church of Jesus Christ, not the church, the man-made religious institution, but what God is doing with his remnant. Oh, Tamsin, thank you so much. Thank you. Perfect, Pam. Lovely to see you on the live, my darling. Thank you so much. I didn't have a very good night last night, so I think I'm trying to brighten myself up a little bit so that I feel, so that I look perky and on top of everything. Natasha, my lovely, it's been a while since we saw you, hasn't it? Why do I feel like I haven't seen you for ages? Lovely Lucinda. Magnificent Michelle, welcome. I tell you why I feel like I haven't seen you for ages. It's because it feels like prophetic school is just taking the longest time to actually start. Beautiful Brigitte, welcome. Can we all just celebrate with beautiful Brigitte, please, from Harry Smith? She held her first like a ladies meeting last night, and they are going to go through my books, these books. I'm going to read from my one book this morning. They are going to go through my books, and they started with Eve last night, and she was so filled with excitement. She messaged me when the meeting was over, and she was just like, oh my word, Sally, you won't believe how impacted the women were and how amazing it was. So let's celebrate with Brigitte. She has really stepped out and stepped into what God is calling her to, and it's just incredible that it went so well, and I was praying and it went so well. Radiant Roz, welcome, my lovely, wonderful Wendy. It has, okay. Sassy Sally Goodwin, thank you. I don't mind being a little bit sassy at all. So welcome everybody. Oh, my favorite disruptor is in the house, gorgeous Claudia. Good morning, my lovely. So good to see you. And courageous Claudia with bringing in all the people into what God has for them. Please, I always forget to say this right in the beginning, but please, ladies and gentlemen, love and share these broadcasts so that my face is spread everywhere, because at 55 you don't turning 56 this year, people. I'm turning 56 this year. At 56 you don't necessarily want your face spread everywhere, but you want the word of the Lord spread everywhere. Anointed Anthea, good morning. And come on, people, let us also celebrate that this evening we are going to Paul. We are going to Anthea and her incredible hubby Hadley, and we are going to do the very first Church Without Walls Paul meeting this evening in Anthea's home. So I know Anthea posted all her information on a previous Facebook Live. If you would like to come to the Church Without Walls in Paul, very first meeting this evening, please get in touch with Anthea. Please get in touch with her. You can DM her, you can do whatever you want to do, and let her know that you'd like to be there this evening. So it is just going to be so incredible. Significant Sonia, good morning. Courageous Conrad, Mama Tessa, so good to see you. And I was saying did I say it on the live, or maybe I said it directly to Anthea? I can't remember. Forgive me if I'm repeating myself. Gorgeous, cool, good to have you here. But I was driving somewhere the other day. Heroic Hanneli. Thank you, Hanneli. Thank you. As you get older and your neck goes all old and crepey, I'm trying to disguise my old neck. Beautiful Bertha, good morning. Hanukkah, good morning, my lovely. I was driving somewhere the other day and I saw this bumper sticker on the back of a car. Joyful Jackie, welcome. And it just said, fun night, 7 Feb. With no other details on it. It was literally just fun night, 7 Feb. And I was like, oh, wow, okay, Lord, like, but fun night where? And God's like, fun night, 7 Feb, yes, at Anthea and Hadley, the start of Church Without Walls in Paarl. Come on. Oh, heroic Hilda, thank you, my lovely. Amen, reminding me of that. Church Without Walls. Yes, the fire is in the house. Yes, the fire is in the house. Famous Chantel, good morning. So, yes, I'm super excited about what God is doing at the moment. You know, I'm only human, so I am fairly often quite daunted. Lovely Libby, welcome. And fairly often I also say to the Lord, are you sure that I'm the one that's supposed to be doing these things? Are you sure it's me? And God and the people around me who are close to me and love me keep saying, yes, it is you, but it is just Radiant Renilwe, welcome. Just, you know, organizing these conferences for when Emma Stark comes to Cape Town in June. It's a lot, it really is, but I have an incredible team of people around me and a beautiful community who support all that God is doing, and I'm just so excited for what God is going to do here in Cape Town in the week before the school holidays. I think you are all going to come to the conferences, and then you are going to get set free and liberated and hear the word of the Lord and direction for the future, and then you're going to go off with your families on school holidays and have just the most fabulous on fire time. So that's what I'm trusting for, and just absolute, yeah, just to see freedom come to Cape Town, absolute freedom come to Cape Town, and we need that here, you know. So we have been speaking about Gideon. We spoke about Jeremiah 1, and then we've been looking at Gideon, and we've been looking at his story, and we've been looking, yes, amen, thank you, my lovely, yes. We've been looking at, you know, the lessons we could learn from Gideon. And in my mind, I was like, okay, I'm finished with that now, because we finished the story of Gideon, the whole story of Gideon, not just the story that we've learned in Sunday school and in church, you know, over the years, the whole story, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We learned about all of that over the last few lives. But I keep hearing Abimelech in my head. And last night, the whole night, was going through my brain, and I just was like, okay, you know what, clearly we haven't finished with the story of Gideon. We need to have a look at the story of Abimelech. And because the story of Abimelech actually encompasses quite a few women. We don't always realize that when we read the Bible story, but when you look at the story of Abimelech, who was Gideon's son, it encompasses quite a few women, and women played an enormous role in the story of Abimelech and in actually undoing what Gideon had done wrong, in actually ending the legacy of unrighteousness that Gideon had allowed to take place, because he hadn't completed the task that God had called him to complete. And he had appeased the Israelites. He had bought into and partnered with the fear of man instead of, you know, being who God had called him to be and walking only in the fear of the Lord. And his legacy, because of that, there was a legacy of unrighteousness. And so I want to have a look at that, because there was a woman who, in her subjugated way, she actually partnered with the legacy of unrighteousness. And then there were women that God used to end this legacy of unrighteousness. So we are in Judges chapter 9. And well, let's just go back quickly to Judges chapter 8, verse 30. Now, Judges chapter 8, verse 30 says this. Now, Gideon had 70 sons born to him. 70 sons. 70, okay? For he had many wives. Now, what is the story with 70? And I've taught on this so many times. As far as the Jewish people were concerned, there were 70 nations that descended from Noah. When God wiped everybody out with a flood. Noah came with his ark, his sons and his sons' wives. They reproduced and filled the earth. They walked in the same kind of instruction that God had given Adam. They fell as well in the same way that Adam did. But the Jewish people believed that you could trace 70 nations from Noah. And so 70 is the number of nations. 70 is the number of nations to the Jewish people. It was understood that the number 70 represented the number of nations. Okay. And Gideon has 70 sons. So can you see how if Gideon had done what God had called him to do in its fullness, if Gideon had done what God had called him to do in the fullness of what God had called him to do, if he had completed what God had called him to do, he actually had the ability to impact nations, not just Israel, but nations. He had these 70 sons, and the 70 means nations. He could have impacted nations. Okay, so he had 70 sons born to him from his many wives. However, Judges 8 verse 31 tells us this: and his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whom he named Abimelech. Now, what is interesting about this is that the Amplified Bible calls her a concubine. There are different translations and different people who have called her a prostitute. Now, we also know that many places in the Bible, women were called prostitutes simply because they went against the grain in terms of the expectation of women, was at that time. And they were called prostitutes. And actually, theologians and historians that have looked back have discovered that there was no historical evidence to actually warrant calling them a prostitute. And the word prostitute in Hebrew meant slightly different things back then as the word prostitute does today. But so here Gideon has all these wives, and so in those days the men could have a whole lot of different wives, and it wasn't the way God wanted it to be, believe you me. That wasn't God's. I've actually been asked this question before, where somebody said to me that if Abraham and Gideon and David and all of these people had so many different wives, why can't men have a whole lot of different wives today? Because clearly God, said that was okay. And I had to explain to them that God never said that was okay. God never said to them, go have a whole lot of wives. That he didn't ever. God worked with what he had to bring about his perfect purpose and plan, but that was not it. A whole lot of wives was not it. And as we know, a whole lot of wives and concubines was the downfall of Solomon, who was the wisest man and given wisdom by the Lord and everything else, riches and everything else. But all of his wives and concubines, they were his downfall. So no, the Old Testament, the way people lived in the Old Testament, that is not justification for us to attempt to live the same way, because honestly, really, if that is the way your thought process works. So, but what did happen is men had wives, and wives had status. Okay, so if you were a wife, you had status. So obviously the first wife that a man took then was the one with the most status. And then the second wife and the third wife, and by the time you got to being like the 20th wife or the 40th wife, I think you were just part of a whole big jumble of wives. But you were a wife, which meant that you had a degree of status because you were a wife. Then many men would have concubines, which were women who slept with them, lived in, whatever space they lived in, bore their children, but they were not wives. Unfortunately, the ancient Hebrew language wasn't very clear when it comes to speaking about women, wives, concubines. The words that were used in the ancient Hebrew language were one word could mean a whole lot of different things. The words for mother, grandmother, so you'll see in some translations say this wife, some translations say concubine. In some books in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in one book it will say concubine, and another book it will say wife. And that's because the ancient Hebrew was not very clear. You know, they didn't, it was women, particularly women, but men as well, were kind of all lumped together in one sort of container, you know. So there wasn't a lot of clarity in ancient Hebraic language for woman, wife, grandmother, mother, concubine. So some women could have been wives and they were called concubines. Some women could have been concubines and they were called wives. Whichever the case may be, the men came and they took these women for themselves. And remember, in those days, it was very much a taking and not very much of a woman being able to choose. And obviously somebody like Gideon, who was a judge over Israel for 40 years, who had achieved with the strength of the Lord this enormous victory over the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east, men would have been falling over themselves to marry their daughters off to Gideon, because that gave the family status. Okay, so it's all about proximity to influence. And if you think that we've only do that in this century, no, that is not true. Right back then, at the beginning of time, there was also proximity to influence was very highly sought after. So not in the same way that we do it today, but definitely then. The fathers would have been falling over their feet, tripping over their feet to give their daughters to Gideon, because it gave them proximity to influence, because Gideon was influential because he judged for 40 years. So they had proximity to influence, and they would have literally sold their souls for proximity to influence, and many did, and many still do, unfortunately. Very unfortunately. And in Gideon's case, this had far-reaching, devastating consequences. So he has this concubine in Shechem. If you look at Shechem in the Bible, you'll see Shechem is the place where many incredible things happened. Covenants with the Lord, Abraham's covenant with God, all took place around Shechem. So he had this concubine who was in Shechem, and he bore him a son whom he named Abimelech. Now, this is interesting because I have read some articles or researched some of this, and people say she called him Abimelech. The Amplified very clearly states that Gideon named him Abimelech. Now, what does Abimelech mean? Anybody? Abimelech means, my father is king. Just take a moment. Gideon turned down the kingship, turned down a kingly legacy, a kingly generational legacy. He turned it down because he knew that that was not of God. However, he then has this child, this son, by this concubine, and he calls him Abimelech, and that name means, my father is king. And what is amazing is that he wouldn't have just been thinking of boy baby names and gone, okay, well, I don't know, Thomas sounds good, Matthew sounds good, that he wouldn't have been doing that. Hebrew names, the names given to Hebrew children, particularly boys, were very important. You didn't just pick a name out of nowhere. It was either a generational name, your father's name or your grandfather's name or whatever the case may be, but it meant something. It would have meant something. It wasn't just, you didn't just take a name and stick it on a child's forehead and be like, there we go, that's who you are. That's why when Zechariah said that John the Baptist was to be called John, the whole community was completely, because that wasn't how it was done. It wasn't how it was done at all. So when Gideon, and the Amplified clearly states that Gideon named him Abimelech, and his name meant my father is king. And to me, that just suggests that there was 40 years of peace in Israel after the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east were defeated, and Gideon was ruling as a judge over Israel over that time. But that suggests to me that every now and again he thought about the fact that he could have been king, and he actually would quite have liked to have been king, I think. And so when you call your child, my father is king, You kind of are sort of subliminally suggesting that even though you didn't accept the kingship for yourself, you still feel like actually you should have maybe been king, or you feel like you are king anyway, because that is quite an ego statement, that to name your child my father is king. And you will notice that the other 70 sons, there is only one other son of Gideon's who's actually named, and that's the youngest one that Abimelech didn't manage to kill, and he was Jotham. But basically none of the other 70 sons are named. None of the other ones are named, apart from Abimelech and Jotham. Okay, so it's just amazing. So so let me read to you from my book, volume 1. And this is on page 142. And it is called Gideon's Wives, Concubines, and the Women with the Millstone. So these are all the women that surrounded the story of Gideon and the story of Abimelech, okay? And one woman, unfortunately, managed to set unrighteousness up to prosper, but then another woman came in and shut that thing down. So, in this devotional, I'm reading from here. In this devotional, we are going to talk about several women. I cannot tell you exactly how many, and that is because we will be looking at Gideon's wives, Gideon's concubine, and the mystery woman who dropped the millstone on Abimelech's head. Nobody knows exactly how many wives Gideon had. The stories of these women are briefly told in Judges 8 and 9. In Judges 8 verse 30, scripture tells us that Gideon had 70 sons, for he had many wives. And then in verse 31, it says that he also had a concubine in Shechem who bore him yet another son, Abimelech. And Abimelech's name means my father is king. Okay. Now Abimelech clearly had some soul wounds since he was not Gideon's legitimate son. So according to biblical text, Gideon had 70 sons that would have been seen as legitimate because they were sons of his wives. And then he had Abimelech, who was the son of a concubine. Some people call her a prostitute. And he would not have been legitimate in the way that the other sons were legitimate because of that. Okay, so if we go back to Judges chapter 8, and we learn that the Israelites just turned back to Baal, etc., after Gideon died. Judges chapter 9. Now Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, or Gideon, went to Shechem to his mother's kinsmen, okay, his mother's family, and said to them and to the whole clan of his mother's family, say, I pray you, in the hearing of all the men of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal reign over you, or that one man rule over you? Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. So Abimelech goes to his mother's family who live in Shechem, okay? His mother's family, and he says to them, effectively, he talks about succession here, and he says to them, succession. And he says to them, so Gideon was a judge. Now, for some reason, they have this understanding that one of the sons or all the sons are now going to be raised up as judges over Israel, which was impossible, and it didn't happen like that. God raised up judges. God raised up deliverers as Israel required them. Gideon had died. Israel had fallen back into sin. Literally immediately, the moment Gideon died, Israel fell back into sin, and effectively God was now waiting for them. God was now going to go back through the cycle of bringing nations against them, or bringing someone against them, so that they would turn back to God and call out to him, and then he would raise up another judge, another deliverer, and he would deliver Israel from the hands of their enemies. And then whilst that judge was there, everything would be peaceful, everything would be wonderful, and the moment that judge died, Israel would fall back into sin. I mean, honestly, just talking about the cycle makes me exhausted. It must have been exhausting for the Lord to watch this happen again and again and again and again and again until he was like, calm down. So Abimelech must have been a very charismatic, very dynamic guy, because he goes to his mother's family in Shechem and he says to them, listen, do you want 70 men reigning over you, which it was a ridiculous suggestion. It had never happened before. The God was not going to raise up a judge from Gideon's sons. He was going to raise up somebody separate. So it wasn't going to happen like that. But he puts it to them. You see political propaganda full force in use all these centuries ago. He puts it to them as if this is a real possibility. And he's like, wouldn't you rather just have one person over you, me, and don't forget that I'm your flesh and blood? Oh, manipulation maxed. Don't forget that I'm your flesh and blood. So wouldn't you rather that this happened? And then also, of course, I'm your family. Don't forget, I'm your family. So you need to, because I'm your family. I mean, how many times have we not heard these things from our families today, using the good old flesh and blood argument as a reason to get you to do something you don't want to do, or be someone you don't want to be, or move forward in some way you don't want to move forward. But I'm your flesh and blood. You remember? Just remember when Jesus' mother and his brothers came to fetch Jesus when he was ministering, because they thought he was going insane. They literally thought he was losing his mind. And they came, and somebody says to Jesus, here are your mother and your brothers. And Jesus said, these ones around me are my mother and my brothers. And to a degree, in this day and age, we have made family an idol, where we put family before God, where what our family thinks and says and does and believes and everything about who we are and what we should be doing is more important to us than what God says who God says we are and what we should be doing. We have made family an idol in the current age, but it's nothing. There's nothing new under the sun, so there was nothing new there. Abimelech was like, I'm your flesh and blood people. I'm bone of your bone, blood of your blood, flesh of your flesh. You need to support me. Whether you like it or not, whether you agree or not, I'm your family. Oh my goodness, that's so manipulative. So manipulative. And so they say his mother's kinsmen spoke all these words concerning him in the hearing of all the men of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. So his mother's family now go to the gates. The men would meet at the gates of the city, and they now repeat everything Abimelech has said to the greater population in Shechem, to the other men of Shechem, and they now convince all the other men as well that this is what needs to happen, that Abimelech needs to be made king. He needs to rule over Israel. And they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and foolhardy men who followed him. So this family of his, they give him 70 pieces of silver. And you know, when the Bible tells you that somebody is being given pieces of silver, it is generally not going to end well for them. Okay, we think of Judas, we think of, the man who took the pieces of silver to make an idol. I forget where it is, but it's just never going to end well. So they give him 70 pieces of silver, and he hires. So these men in Shechem, they don't go with him to do what he wants to do. But they've said to him, it's fine, you can rule, we're okay with that, you're our family. Proximity to influence, again, is an enormous temptation here. If Abimelech rules over everyone, we have proximity to influence because he is family. And then Abimelech would have found that same argument preached back at him. But we your family, but we your flesh and blood, but we. Pfft. So he then hires worthless and foolhardy men to follow him. It's not like these wonderful, great, fabulous warriors all pour out in support of Abimelech. No, he has to hire worthless, foolhardy men. I mean, how he didn't see where this was all going then, I'm not quite sure. And again, does it not, these stories, can you not just place them in our context in various places today, right? He went to his father's house at Ophrah and slew his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. He slew his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. And all the men of Shechem gathered together, and all of Beth Millo, and they went and made Abimelech king by the oak or terebinth of the pillar in Shechem. And so Abimelech was crowned the first king in Israel. Okay, he wasn't the first king of Israel because he wasn't appointed by God, but he was the first person to be crowned king in Israel. And all it took was some witty speech, some charismatic kind of personality, some money. It always requires money. And here is Abimelech, and he's now king. And then we go on to Jotham, but I'm not going to go on to Jotham right now. So listen to this. When Gideon died, Abimelech caused his mother's relatives and the town of Shechem to support him as he slew his half-brothers. He ended up destroying Shechem and going to war against Tebez. And whilst he was trying to burn the people of Tebez to death, this is Abimelech, okay? Self-appointed king of Israel, managed to convince his family to support him, okay? He kills all of his half-brothers, and then, not happy with that, he now lands up going to war against the city of Tebez, and he tries to burn the people of Tebez to death. He's basically, it's those, the walled cities, if you set them alight, obviously from the inside, it was very difficult for people to get out. So, whilst he was trying to burn the people of Tebez to death, a mystery woman dropped a millstone on his head, cracking his skull. It is just incredible. So we have Jotham, and Jotham has his whole say, and then he runs away. Judges chapter 9, verse 21. And Abimelech reigned 3 years over Israel. Okay, Abimelech reigned 3 years over Israel. Judges 9, verse 22. 23, God sent an evil spirit. Can we take a moment? God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the men of Shechem, and the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. There are only 1 or 2 occasions in the Bible where it talks about God sending a spirit that is going to do evil instead of good. And I think our brains and everything we've been taught about God, we struggle with that. But God created everything. God is sovereign. God uses everything. And so God sent this evil spirit, and that's why sometimes we have to be careful, because if that was today and Abimelech was a dynamic, charismatic leader who drew millions to him and wasn't actually walking in holiness, righteousness, and purity, which is what God is requiring of us even more today than ever before, God could send an evil spirit to stir up strife for that person, and we will all be, oh my word, this is spiritual warfare. We need to bind, and we need to loose, and we need to take it out, etc., etc. Sometimes we need to say to the Lord, even though this is evil, are you allowing this to happen? Because you are trying to expose something. You know how at the moment in the body of Christ, just people falling left, right, and center. And the people who are exposing them are being called the accuser of the brethren. Because we shouldn't accuse the brethren even if they're doing terrible things. We shouldn't accuse the brethren even if they are molesting children. We shouldn't accuse the brethren even if they are guilty of all sorts of assaults on women and children. We shouldn't accuse, and as soon as you try and expose something and bring it into the light, then you are called the accuser of the brethren. No, God allows, because things have got to be exposed. So Abimelech reigned for 3 short years, and that was enough for the Lord. And the Lord was like, right, now we're going to expose this, and we're going to bring an end to this evil influence here. And so he sends an evil spirit to stir up strife between Abimelech and the people of Shechem, who, remember, were his flesh and blood. They were his flesh and blood. And the flesh and blood argument did not work any longer for Abimelech. Then the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might come, and that their blood might be laid upon Abimelech their brother, who slew them, and upon the men of Shechem, who strengthened his hands to slay his brothers. So now, you know how it says in the Bible that the blood of the martyrs calls out from the ground? There was no reason for those 70 brothers to be slain. There was no reason for that to happen. And so their blood was calling out. Abimelech might have been the one who spilt that blood, but the people of Shechem enabled him to spill that blood. And it is the same in the church today, where you might have this one person who did these terrible things, but they are surrounded by a leadership, they are surrounded by a community, they are surrounded by other leaders who have protected them, who have covered for them, who have pretended everything was fine, who have not called out to the greater church what has actually been going on, who have simply protected their own and not protected the wider church. That those people are the same in that they have enabled whatever it was that one person did. It is not okay. It is wrong on so many levels. And God is exposing and dealing, but we often focus on the one person who's done the bad things and fallen. But we need to be spreading the net a little bit wider and looking at all the people and all the leaders who enabled that person to walk in the sin they walked in without ever doing anything about it or without ever exposing it. So the blood of Abimelech's brothers was not only on Abimelech's hands, it was on the hands of the people of Shechem, who hadn't even gone to fight with him, but had given him the finances to ensure that he could carry out what he wanted to carry out. Be careful where you put your money, people. Be careful where you put your money. Make sure that you are not enabling unrighteousness, unholiness, and impurity with your finances. So verse 25, Judges 9, the men of Shechem ambush Abimelech, and or they set an ambush against Abimelech, and they rob a whole lot of other people because they're just being indiscriminate about what they're doing here. And they eat, they drink, they curse Abimelech, and then this Gaal guy comes along, and he's like, why should we be serving Abimelech, blah, blah. And Abimelech, I don't want to read all of it, otherwise we'll be here all day. And Abimelech rises up in ambush, and all of this happens, and they go and they fight. Gaal's men fight Abimelech's men, and Abimelech chased him, many fell wounded. And here we go, and he looks to destroy everybody, basically. Sorry, I'm trying to find, here we go. He looks to destroy everybody. And then verse 48, Abimelech went up to Mount Zalman, and he and all the men with him. And Abimelech took an axe in his hand and cut down a bundle of brush, picked it up and laid it on his shoulder. And he said to the men with him, what you have seen me do, make haste to do also. So here they go, and they burn the people, all the people in the Tower of Shechem. They burn them to death, about 1,000 men and women. Abimelech burns them to death, about 1,000 men and women in the Tower of Shechem, the city that had supported him, the people who were his family, his flesh and blood. Not so happy about your proximity to influence now, are we? Then Abimelech went to Tebez and encamped against Tebez and took it. But there was a strong tower in the city. There was always a strong tower in the city. And all the people of the city, men and women, fled to it, shut themselves in, and went to the roof of the tower. So Abimelech thinks, okay, you know what? I'll just do the same thing in Tebez that I did in Shechem. I'll just burn the tower and burn all the people inside it. Because the tower was always, that's why it says in Psalms, the Lord is your strong tower, run to him. Because in ancient times, the cities always had a strong tower that was fortified. And if it looked like they were being overtaken by enemies, then the people would withdraw into the strong tower. They would all be in one place, and that strong tower would be guarded. But we don't need strong towers anymore because we have God. We have God. Okay, so listen to this. But a certain woman, no name, Judges 9 verse 53, but a certain woman cast an upper millstone down upon Abimelech's head and broke his skull. Then he called hastily to the young man, his armor bearer, and said to him, draw your sword and slay me, so that men may not say of me, a woman slew him. Oh, my soul, all he was interested in is that nobody would think it was a woman that had killed him. And his young man thrust him through, and he died. And when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, they departed, each man to his home. Verse 56, thus God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech, which he had done to his father Gideon, who was dead, by slaying his 70 sons. And all the wickedness of the men of Shechem, God repaid upon their heads, and caused to come upon them the curse of Jotham, son of Jerubbaal, the one of Gideon's sons that got away, because he cursed at them in Judges 9. So let's just read this. Okay, here. While he was trying to burn the people of Tebez to death, a mystery woman dropped a millstone on his head, cracking his skull. Abimelech's last words to his armor-bearer were a request that he, the armor-bearer, slay him, so that men may not say of me, a woman slew him. Little did he know that this fact would be recorded for all eternity, as God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech, which he had done to his father Gideon, by slaying his 70 brothers. This fact became biblical record. As much as Gideon tried to avoid, as much as Abimelech tried to avoid people knowing that it was a woman who had killed him, God made sure that that fact was biblical record, that for all eternity it will stand in the word of the Lord, that it was a woman that dropped the millstone on his head, and that he didn't want to be known as the guy who was killed by a woman. So, what can we, now ladies particularly, pay particular attention to this, okay? What can we, as women today, learn from all of this? None of these women are named. None of them were responsible for the terrible things that occurred. Possibly, Abimelech's mother poisoned his mind against his half-brothers, or instigated and manipulated his actions somehow. We don't know for sure, as there's almost nothing written about any of these women in any of the resources I customarily use for my research, and I've used mainly Jewish resources. So maybe, Gideon was the one who called Abimelech, my father is king. And maybe that created a false expectation or false hope for Abimelech's mother, who wasn't granted the same status as Gideon's other wives. And maybe she did speak out her hopes and expectations to him as she raised him. And maybe that did, poison his mind or cause him to think a certain way. But ultimately, he chose to do what he did. And the men of Shechem supported him. We do know, we do know that one woman bore a person who was responsible for the grief and mourning of many women. So Abimelech's mother bore Abimelech, who then became responsible for the grief and the mourning of all the mothers of Gideon's 70 sons. And then one woman ended his reign of terror and brought peace to the land. Maybe that's what we learn today. That the women who went before us, may have begun things, may have bowed to things, unrighteous things, ungodly things, born out of their own painful experiences. In our generational lines, in our families, in our communities, in our regions, in our nations. And we get to be the women who drop a godly millstone and bring peace to generational lines, families, communities, regions, nations. So there might be a woman in our family lines, or more than one woman, who were responsible for bowing to things, or beginning unrighteous things, or beginning ungodly things. But we get to be the women who drop the godly millstone on those things and fight those battles so that our children's children will not have to fight them. Daughter of God, We may not have been there at the beginning of issues like patriarchy, misogyny, chauvinism, abuse. We may not have been there at the beginning of these issues, but we can be the ones who end them. Let ours, yours and mine, let ours be the names mentioned in the eternal records where it will say, a woman slew them. So we weren't there at the beginnings. We weren't there at the beginnings of patriarchy. We weren't there at the beginnings of misogyny. We weren't there at the beginnings of chauvinism. We weren't there at the beginnings of abuse. We weren't there at the beginnings of racism. We weren't there at the beginnings of xenophobia. We weren't there at the beginnings of the terrible things of hate and anger and the terrible things that flood the earth today. We weren't there at the beginning of those things. And possibly some women in our generational lines bought into those things, bowed their knee to those things, formed a part of those things. But we are not held captive by that. We can be those women who in the eternal records that God keeps, it will say a woman slew them. So maybe a woman partnered with them, maybe a woman instigated something, maybe a woman acted unrighteously somewhere and brought about some of these things, but we can be the ones who end them. And if we each take the responsibility of ending these things in our generation, for our generational lines, then we can wipe them out. Because that is what I want it to say in the eternal records, in my eternal records. I want my eternal records to say, a woman slew them. A woman stood up to this. A woman crushed that. A woman sorted that out. A woman came against that. And we need to understand that the spiritual influence from this sort of thing goes far and wide. So we might think, oh my goodness, we only doing this for our family, we only doing this for our community, we only doing this for our region, but it will impact nations. It will impact nations. If that woman had not dropped that millstone on Abimelech's head, who knows how many people he would have slaughtered. Who knows how many people he would have slaughtered. He'd already burned about 1,000 people to death in the Tower of Shechem, the city that had supported him, the city that contained his flesh and blood, his mother's family. And when a push came to shove, he felt nothing for burning them to death in that tower. And then he thought, oh wow, that was such an easy way out. I'm just going to shoot over here to Tibes, and because they don't want to listen to me, and because they're running into their strong tower, I'm just going to burn them to death as well. Because this is an easy way to just make everybody, accept my rule. I'll just burn everybody who disagrees to death. And is that not something that we have seen in history over and over and over again? And does it not start looking like the right thing every time? Abimelech's explanation to his people in Shechem were, do you want 70 people ruling over you, or do you just want one person ruling over you? And you're my flesh and blood. So just imagine how wonderful it will be for you, your proximity to influence. You're my family. I'm going to treat you so much better than everybody else. Oh, okay, that sounds wonderful. Yes, let's set you up as king. And then starts the wholesale slaughter of every person who disagreed with him, including the very people who put him in power. And how many times does that happen, and is that not happening on the earth today, where somebody has power to change so many things, and the things that they are changing are the things that eventually, we wonder where somebody like Hitler, for example, came from. Hitler didn't just appear out of nowhere and all the people of Germany bowed down before him. It took years of laying the groundwork, convincing them he was doing the right thing, giving them arguments about why this should be the case and why that should be the case, spreading propaganda, spreading lies, spreading misinformation, spreading disinformation, making people feel scared, making people feel afraid, making them feel that now they needed to protect what was theirs because who knew who was out there who wanted to steal it from them. And that all ended up in Auschwitz with millions of people slaughtered, gassed in camps, dying like animals of starvation and abuse and treated like less than human beings. Don't let us be those frogs. You know that if you put a frog in water and you put it on to boil, I've never done this, I've only read about it, and as you know, the water's cool when you first put the frog in. As you heat it up, the frog doesn't jump out until he eventually dies. Let us not be those who are boiled alive by people who say all the right things, but are not doing what they can do to make the world a better place, to make people feel less scared. When somebody spreads fear, that is not of God. That is not of God. But we can be the women who stop that. We can be the women who say, no, not on our watch. Not on our watch. No, sorry. No, I don't agree with that. I might be the only person who doesn't agree with that. I might be the lone voice in the wilderness. I might be completely crushed on social media because everybody's a keyboard warrior these days and nobody confronts anything head on. They all sit behind their keyboards and release their evil into the world. And a lot of those people, unfortunately, are people who call themselves Christians. But at this time, in the world today, we are called to stand up for what is right, to stand for righteousness, to stand for God's justice, to stand for holiness, to stand for purity. Even if we're the only ones. Even if we feel like we are the only ones who have not bowed our knees to Baal, there will always be somebody else. There will always be somebody else who hasn't. So, let us be those women and men. Let us be those men and women who say no. Sorry, not today. Not while I stand here. Not while I have breath in my body, breath that God gave me. Am I going to countenance injustice, unrighteousness, and treating people like they are less than when they have been created in the image of God, whether they know it and accept it or not? Nobody is less than, because they are all created in the image of our God. And whether they know it or believe it is irrelevant. We know it. We know it. Okay, so that was this week's episode of Friday Feast. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that you heard everything that I was trying to put across about poor Abimelech and his terrible things that he did, and the women who put a stop to it. She didn't faff, she didn't fuss, she didn't think too much about it. She just picked up that millstone, popped it on his head. There we go, we're done. We're sorted, we're all okay, everything's fine. Women who take decisive action. Decisive action. So, remember my books, volume 1, 2, and 3. Here's volume 3. I can't see where volume 2 is. Volume 1, 2, and 3. If you go onto my website, Activate Her, you will be able to purchase them from my shop. I love you all. Have a fabulous weekend. celebrate with us in the spirit if you can't make it in the flesh, as we launch Church Without Walls poll this evening. And I will see you all again on Monday morning for Start Your Week with Sally. Love you. Bless you. Bye.